My name is Kawika Mahoe, and I serve as an enforcement officer with the Department of Hawaiian Homelands on Molokai. If you're watching this from anywhere on the mainland, you probably think Hawaii is paradise. Beaches, resorts, luau's for tourists. But Molokai isn't like the other islands. We have no traffic lights, no elevators, no chain stores, and we like it that way. What we do have is something the tourist board will never mention. A forest where death prayers from the 1650s are still actively killing people, and a legacy of spiritual warfare that makes Salem look like a disagreement over tea. Molokai is called the Friendly Isle in the guidebooks. That's marketing. The real name, the one spoken in whispers by natives who know, is Pu'ulanaena, the island of death prayers. And I'm the officer who has to retrieve the bodies when outsiders ignore our warnings about the kapu zones. It started 3 weeks ago, October 7th, 2024. I got a call about missing hikers in the Kaunakakai forest. 2 mainland college students who'd ignored the no trespassing kapu signs because they thought it meant keep area pristine usually. They'd been missing for 72 hours. In most places, that would mean search and rescue. On Molokai, it means recovery and ritual cleansing. I found them on the 4th day, and I wish I hadn't. They were standing upright in a grove of kukui trees, perfectly preserved like statues. Not dead, that would have been merciful. They were suspended between life and death, their eyes open but reflecting scenes from 1650, their mouths moving in prayers that hadn't been spoken for centuries. When I touched Marcus Chen's shoulder to check for a pulse, I experienced his last 3 days through his eyes in a matter of seconds. He'd entered the forest looking for Instagram-worthy shots of authentic Hawaii. What he found was a clearing where reality was thinner than paper. In that clearing, the Kahuna Wars of the 17th century were still being fought. Sorcerers hurling death prayers at each other with such intensity that the very air had crystallized with lethal intent. Marcus had walked into a prayer meant for someone who'd been dead for 400 years, and now he was caught in its loop, dying over and over again, unable to complete the death because he wasn't the intended target. I called it in to my supervisor, Edith Kaho'ohanohano, a woman who'd been dealing with Molokai's spiritual hazards for 30 years. "Don't move them," she said immediately. "Don't even touch them again." "I'm sending Uncle Tommy." Uncle Tommy Ka'aukai wasn't really anyone's uncle, but that's what everyone called the 87-year-old kahuna, who served as our unofficial spiritual first responder. He arrived within the hour, took one look at the scene, and began preparing for something I'd only heard about in stories, a prayer battle with the dead. "The ana is still active," he explained, pulling out tea leaves, sea salt, and a carved tiki that looked older than the island itself. "These prayers, when cast by true kahuna, don't dissipate. They wait, they hunt, they fulfill their purpose even if it takes centuries." "Can you save them?" I asked. He looked at me with the eyes that had seen too much. "The question isn't can I save them, it's whether they want to be saved. They've been experiencing the moment of death for 4 days. Their minds might prefer to complete the journey rather than return." What happened next still gives me nightmares. Uncle Tommy began chanting in Old Hawaiian, not the Hawaiian taught in schools, but the deep language, the one that predated Western contact. As he chanted, the air in the clearing began to thicken. I could see them, translucent figures in traditional kapa cloth, warriors and sorcerers still fighting their eternal battle. And among them, impossibly, were others, Japanese soldiers from World War II, still in uniform. Spanish conquistadors who'd somehow made it to Hawaii in the 1500s. American missionaries from the 1820s, all caught in the crossfire of death prayers that didn't care about time period or nationality, all dying eternally in that cursed grove. But the worst part was what Uncle Tommy whispered to me while maintaining his chant. This isn't natural. Someone's been feeding the prayers, keeping them active, weaponizing them. Before he could explain, Marcus Chen's body convulsed. When his mouth opened, a voice that wasn't his spoke in perfect 17th century Hawaiian. Uncle Tommy translated without breaking his own chant. The treaty is broken. The old agreements are void. The island will reclaim what was taken. The death of the old ways demands payment in blood. That's when I learned the first truth about Molokai that the history books won't tell you. In 1650, the kahuna of Molokai made a spiritual treaty. They would contain their death prayers to specific areas, create kapu zones where the lethal energy could dissipate without harming innocents. In exchange, these zones would remain untouched forever, sacred spaces where the veil between life and death stayed thin as a memorial to their power. But in 2019, a development company had tried to build a resort on the edge of one of these zones. They'd bulldozed 3 acres before local protests stopped them. Those 3 acres had contained 17 death prayers, sealed and dormant. Now they were free. And they were hungry. Uncle Tommy managed to extract Marcus and his companion, Sarah Williams, from the prayer loop, but they weren't the same. Marcus couldn't stop speaking in ancient Hawaiian, describing battles he'd never fought, naming ancestors he'd never had. Sarah aged 15 years in 15 minutes, then reversed back to her normal age, trapped in a temporal fluctuation caused by experiencing multiple deaths across multiple centuries. We got them to Molokai General Hospital, but within hours, the federal agents arrived. Not FBI, not NSA, something else. They wore badges from the Office of Indigenous Metaphysical Events, a department I'd never heard of. Agent Linda Nakamura, a Japanese Hawaiian woman with eyes that suggested she'd seen worse than what we were dealing with, took over the scene immediately. "Mr. Mayho," she said, reviewing my report, "how long have you been aware of the active ana-ana sites on Molokai?" "Everyone knows about the kapu zones," I replied carefully. "We just avoid them." "That's not what I asked. How long have you known they're actively hunting people?" I thought about lying, but something in her expression told me she already knew the truth. 3 years. Ever since the resort construction disturbed the containment. She nodded. "And in those 3 years, how many unreported deaths?" 7 that I know of. All ruled as hiking accidents or natural causes. "Show me the sites." All of them. Over the next 3 hours, I took Agent Nakamura and her team to every kapu zone I knew about. There were 13 official ones, places marked on our maps as dangerous, either due to unstable terrain or cultural significance. But there were others, unmarked places that locals just knew to avoid. The Waikolu Valley, where even birds wouldn't fly across. The grove of standing stones where compasses spun wildly and GPS units showed locations that didn't exist on Earth. The pathway to nowhere. A trail that looked normal but led walkers into 1893, right into the middle of the Hawaiian Kingdom's overthrow. At each site, Nakamura's team took readings with equipment that looked like it belonged in a sci-fi movie. Electromagnetic scanners, quantum field detectors, something they called a thanatic resonance meter that measured death energy. "It's worse than we thought," she finally said, looking at her tablet. "The death prayers aren't just active, they're evolving. Evolving, learning, adapting. For 400 years, they were simple weapons. Point, shoot, kill. But exposure to modern consciousness, modern fears, modern technology, they're becoming more sophisticated, more autonomous." She showed me a video from a hidden camera at one of the sites. It showed a death prayer as a visible distortion in the air, moving through the forest with purpose, hunting. It paused at a tourist hiking trail, seemed to consider, then deliberately moved toward a solo hiker who was taking photos. The hiker dropped dead instantly, his camera capturing his final moment, a look of absolute terror as something invisible entered his chest. That hiker was reported as a heart attack, Nakamura said. But look at the timestamp. He died at 3:33 a.m. So, he was in California at 3:33 a.m. The prayer killed him from 2,600 miles away because he'd taken a rock from Molokai 6 months earlier. The implications were staggering. Every tourist who'd taken a souvenir, every developer who'd disturbed sacred ground, every person who'd ignored the kapu warnings, they were all potential targets for prayers that could now hunt across space and time. "We need to talk to your kahuna," Nakamura said. "The real ones. Not the ones who do blessings for hotels, the ones who still know the old ways." "They won't talk to you," I said. "They'll talk to you." She was right. That evening, I gathered 5 of the most powerful kahuna still living on Molokai. They met us at the old Halawa Valley Pavilion, a place where ancient and modern Hawaii uneasily coexisted. The eldest, Auntie Lilia Kamaka, was 94 years old and blind, but she could see things others couldn't. "We've been expecting this," she said before any of us could speak. "The Ana are waking up. They sense the destruction of the sacred places. They're angry." "Can you stop them?" Nakamura asked. Auntie Lilia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Stop them? Child, we can barely contain them. Every year, more sacred sites are disturbed. Every year, the prayers grow stronger. And now," she paused, her blind eyes turning toward something none of us could see. "Now they're being fed by someone who wants them to break free completely." "Who?" I asked. "Someone who remembers the old wars. Someone who never agreed to the treaty. Someone who believes Hawaii should belong only to those who can survive the death prayers." Before she could say more, the lights went out. Not just in the pavilion, across all of Molokai. In the darkness we could see them, countless points of light moving through the forest, each one a death prayer seeking a target. "They're hunting," Auntie Lilia whispered, "and tonight they're not limiting themselves to the kapu zones." That's when I realized the truth about Molokai. It wasn't just an island with a dark history. It was a battlefield where an ancient war was still being fought, where death itself had been weaponized and abandoned, left to fester and evolve for 4 centuries. And now, someone had just declared the ceasefire over. The island-wide blackout lasted exactly 13 minutes, long enough for 47 people to die. When the lights came back on, we found them scattered across Molokai, tourists in their hotel rooms, locals in their homes, all with the same expression of absolute terror frozen on their faces. No wounds, no signs of struggle, just death by pure spiritual violence. Agent Nakamura's equipment went haywire, detecting thanatic resonance levels that should have been impossible. Every death had occurred at precisely the same moment, 11:47 p.m., regardless of where the victims were on the island. "This is coordinated," she said, studying the data. "Someone's controlling them, directing them." Auntie Lilia hadn't moved from her spot during the blackout. While the rest of us had panicked, she'd been listening to something we couldn't hear. "The Keeper has awakened," she finally said. "I know who's doing this." She told us a story that had been carefully omitted from every history book about Hawaii. In 1650, at the height of the Kahuna Wars, there was one sorcerer whose power terrified both sides. His name was Kahai Makaio, and he had discovered something that should have remained hidden: how to make death prayers self-sustaining, self-replicating, essentially turning them into spiritual viruses that could spread and evolve. The other kahuna, realizing the existential threat he posed, had united against him. It took 17 of the most powerful sorcerers to defeat him, and even then, they couldn't kill him completely. Death prayers, when they reach a certain level of power, create a kind of immortality for their caster. Instead, they imprisoned him in a state between life and death, sealed in a cave beneath the Kalaupapa Peninsula. For 374 years, he's been conscious but immobilized, Auntie Lelia explained, feeling every death his prayers caused, feeding on that energy, growing stronger. The resort construction in 2019 cracked his prison. Not enough to free him, but enough for him to start influencing the active prayers again. "Where exactly is this cave?" Nakamura asked. "Under the old leper colony, Kalaupapa." My blood ran cold. Kalaupapa had been a place of immense suffering. Thousands of people with Hansen's disease forcibly exiled there between 1866 and 1969, left to die in isolation. If Kahai had been feeding on that pain for over a century. "We need to get there now," I said. "No." Auntie Lilia grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Going there unprepared is suicide. You need protection, real protection, and you need to understand what you're truly facing." She had Uncle Tommy and the other kahuna begin preparing us. The protection ritual took 3 hours and involved elements I'd never seen before. Water from 7 different sacred springs, salt from the ancient Pa'akai beds, and most disturbing, a drop of blood from someone who had survived a death prayer. That someone turned out to be me. "When you touched the frozen hikers," Uncle Tommy explained, "the prayer tasted you but rejected you. You have protection in your bloodline. Your grandmother was Laura Mayho. I knew my grandmother had been special, but I never knew why. What about her? She was the last true kahuna of the Maho line. She bound her mana to your bloodline, creating a spiritual armor that passes to each generation. That's why you can walk in the Kapu zones without dying immediately." While they prepared us, Agent Nakamura received a video call that changed everything. It was from Dr. James Winters at the Pacific Paranormal Research Center in Honolulu. "We've detected similar awakening events on all the Hawaiian Islands," he reported. "Death prayers that have been dormant for centuries are activating. But Molokai is the epicenter. Whatever's happening there is affecting the entire chain." Nakamura turned to me. "We need to understand the full history. Everything that's been hidden." Auntie Lilia sighed deeply. "Then you need to know about the Japanese soldiers." In 1946, a year after World War II ended, an American patrol found something impossible in a sealed cave on Molokai's north shore. 42 Japanese soldiers from a unit that had been planning to invade Hawaii were discovered perfectly preserved, mummified while standing at attention, still holding their rifles. They'd been dead since 1942, but their bodies showed no signs of decay. The official report claimed they'd been trapped in a cave-in, Auntie Lilia said. The truth was different. They'd stumbled into one of Kahai's secondary prayer chambers. The death prayers there were so concentrated, so powerful, that they killed the soldiers instantly, but also preserved them, trapping their spirits in an eternal moment of dying. "What happened to the bodies?" Nakamura asked. "The military took them. But not to return them to Japan. They took them to a facility on Ford Island. They wanted to study the preservation effect, weaponize it maybe." Nakamura made a call. 20 minutes later, she had confirmation. The bodies were still at a classified facility at Pearl Harbor, and they were still perfectly preserved. More disturbing, Instruments showed they were still dying. 8 decades later, the death prayers were still actively killing them in an endless loop. "There's more," Auntie Lelia continued. "In the 1960s, during the Cold War, the military tried to weaponize the death prayers. Project Soul Strike. They brought in scientists, psychics, even recruited a few native kahuna with promises of protecting Hawaiian culture. They tried to create controllable death prayers that could eliminate targets anywhere in the world. What happened? 37 researchers died in one night. The prayers turned on them. The project was shut down. The facility abandoned. But the research... Someone kept the research. A horrible thought occurred to me. The resort developers in 2019. What if they weren't trying to build a resort? What if they knew exactly what they were disturbing? Nakamura was already pulling up records. The development company, Paradise Holdings LLC, had dissolved immediately after the protests stopped construction. But its parent company had interesting connections, all leading back to a defense contractor that had worked on classified projects in the 1960s. "Son of a bitch," she muttered. "They were trying to excavate something. The construction was just cover." Before we could process this, Uncle Tommy's phone rang. He listened, his face growing increasingly grave. "There's been another incident. The Ho'olahua Post Office." The Ho'olahua Post Office was famous for one thing. It let tourists mail coconuts as postcards. Thousands of coconuts with "Aloha from Molokai" written on them were sent worldwide every year. When we arrived, we found the postal workers frozen mid-motion, but alive, their eyes moving frantically but their bodies completely paralyzed. On every coconut waiting to be mailed, over 300 of them, the same message had appeared, burned into the husk in ancient Hawaiian. "The payment comes due. The land reclaims its mana. Those who steal from Molokai will return what was taken, in blood or in spirit." He's going to kill everyone who's ever taken something from the island, I realized. Every tourist with a rock or shell, everyone who mailed a coconut, everyone who carries a piece of Molokai with them. Auntie Lelia finished. Millions of people worldwide. Agent Nakamura immediately contacted her superiors. Within an hour, the CDC issued a vague health warning about contaminated souvenirs from Hawaii, trying to get people to dispose of items without causing panic. But we knew it wouldn't be enough. "We have to stop him at the source," Nakamura decided. "We go to Kalaupapa tonight. That's what he wants," Auntie Lelia warned. "He's been preparing for 374 years. The leper colony's suffering has given him power we can't imagine." "Then what do you suggest?" The old woman was quiet for a moment, then spoke words that chilled me to my core. "We need the Night Marchers." The Night Marchers, the spirits of ancient Hawaiian warriors who still patrol the islands, were not to be summoned lightly. They were as dangerous as any death prayer, maybe more so. But they were also the only force that might match Kahai's power. "I know where they gather," Uncle Tommy said quietly. "The Waikolu Valley, where even the death prayers don't go." We prepared to enter the most forbidden place on Molokai, to request help from warriors who had been dead for 1,000 years, to fight a sorcerer who had turned death itself into a weapon. As we drove toward the valley, the radio crackled with emergency reports. People were dying worldwide: Sydney, Tokyo, Los Angeles, New York. Anyone who'd ever taken something from Molokai was being targeted. The death toll was climbing into the hundreds. "How do we know the Night Marchers will help us?" I asked Uncle Tommy. "We don't," he admitted. "They might kill us for disturbing them, but they're bound to protect Hawaii from threats to the spiritual balance. Kahai is definitely that." We reached the valley entrance at 2 a.m. The moment we stepped onto the trail, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. In the distance, we could hear them, drums that had been beating for centuries, getting closer. "Don't look at them directly," Uncle Tommy warned. "And whatever you do, don't run. Running marks you as prey." The drumming grew louder. Through the trees, we could see lights, torches that burned without smoke, carried by figures that marched in perfect formation. The night marchers were coming, and suddenly, facing Kahai seemed like the safer option. But we had no choice. To save millions of lives, we had to convince an army of the dead to fight in a war that had started before Captain Cook ever saw these islands. The first warrior emerged from the forest, and I understood why people who saw the night marchers rarely lived to tell about it. He was massive, nearly 7 feet tall, wearing traditional kappa armor and carrying a spear that seemed to be made of crystallized moonlight. His eyes were not eyes, but portals to the afterlife itself. He spoke in a language older than Hawaiian, but somehow I understood him. Why do the living disturb the eternal march? Uncle Tommy stepped forward, showing no fear despite the sweat pouring down his face. "We invoke the ancient compact. The island is threatened by one who breaks the laws of death itself. We request your aid and offer." He paused, then said words that made my heart stop. "We offer a life freely given to restore the balance." "No," I started to protest, but Uncle Tommy continued. "I offer my remaining years to join your march when this is done, if you will help us stop Kahai Makayo." The warrior considered this. Around us, hundreds of night marchers materialized, their ghostly forms illuminating the valley with an otherworldly light. They conferred in their ancient language, and I could feel the weight of centuries of tradition in their deliberation. Finally, the lead warrior spoke. "The offer is heard, but the one who disturbs the order of death has grown beyond our reach. To fight him requires the living and the dead to unite. Are you prepared for such a joining?" "What does that mean?" Nakamura asked. "Some of you must die temporarily," the warrior explained, his voice like distant thunder. "Your spirits will fight beside us while your bodies wait. But if we fail, you remain dead. If we succeed, you return changed. You will see the death that surrounds all living things. You will hear the prayers that hunt in the night. You will never again know peace." I looked at my companions, Agent Nakamura, Uncle Tommy, Auntie Lelia, and the other kahuna. We all knew what we had to do. Millions of lives hung in the balance. "We accept," I said. The warrior raised his spear, and the world exploded into cold fire. I felt my spirit being pulled from my body, lifted into a state between life and death. I could see myself lying on the ground, could see the silver cord that still connected my soul to my flesh, but I could also see so much more. The island was covered in a web of death prayers, thousands of them, all pulsing with malevolent energy, and at the center of the web, beneath Kalo Papa, something massive and dark was stirring. Kahai Makayo was waking up, and he was no longer entirely human. In the spirit realm, Molokai looked like a battlefield from a war that never ended. Every death that had occurred on the island left a mark, a shadow, a whisper, a wound in the spiritual fabric. The leper colony at Kalopapa was the worst. Thousands of souls still wandering, still suffering, their pain feeding the darkness below. The night marchers moved through this landscape like they owned it, which I suppose they did. In life, they had been warriors. In death, they were something more, guardians of the boundary between worlds. Their leader, who I learned was named Kuali'i, had died defending these islands in 1142, 500 years before Western contact. The corrupted one has had centuries to prepare, Kuali'i explained, as we descended toward Kalaupapa. He has woven himself into the island's pain. To extract him would kill Molokai itself. Then how do we stop him? Nakamura asked. Her spirit form flickered with federal training even in death. She was trying to analyze, categorize, find a tactical solution. We don't stop him, Auntie Lilia said. She looked younger in spirit form, but also more tired, as if death had revealed the true weight of her years. We redirect him, she explained as we moved through the spiritual battlefield. Every death prayer needed a target. That was their nature. They were weapons that had to strike something. Kahai had been feeding his prayers with the suffering of Kalaupapa for over a century, but also directing them outward, using them to kill anyone who stole from Molokai. But what if we gave them a different target, she proposed. What if we turned them back on themselves? A spiritual Ouroboros, Uncle Tommy understood. The prayers consuming the prayers. That would require incredible power, Kuali'i said. More than even we possess. That's when I remembered something. The Japanese soldiers. They're still dying, still trapped in that loop. 80 years of death energy, contained but not released. Nakamura's eyes widened in her spirit form. We could weaponize their eternal death against Kahai. It was horrible to contemplate, using the suffering of those soldiers as a weapon. But they were already suffering, had been for decades. At least this would give their torment purpose. I can get us access to the facility, Nakamura said, but we'll need our bodies for that. Kuali'i raised his spear, and I felt myself slammed back into my physical form. The return to flesh was agonizing, like being stuffed into clothes that were too small. But worse was what I brought back with me, the ability to see the spirit realm overlaid on the physical. Death prayers appeared as writhing serpents of dark energy. The suffering of the dead manifested as a gray mist that clung to everything. We have 6 hours until dawn, Uncle Tommy said, checking his watch. After that, Kahai will have gathered enough power to break free physically. The drive to Pearl Harbor took 2 hours. Nakamura's credentials got us through the first 3 checkpoints, but the facility we needed was beyond classified. It took a call to someone she only referred to as the director to get us inside. The warehouse looked abandoned from the outside, but inside was a different story. Row upon row of crystalline containers, each holding a perfectly preserved Japanese soldier, frozen in their moment of death. The air thrummed with contained death energy. Jesus Christ, Nakamura breathed. There must be 500 of them. Not just Japanese, Uncle Tommy noticed, reading labels. Germans, Russians, Vietnamese, they've been collecting preserved death prayer victims from around the world. A man in a white coat emerged from the shadows. Dr. Harrison Chung, the facility's director. Agent Nakamura, I was told to give you full access, but I must protest. These specimens are invaluable for research. Your research ends now, she cut him off. We're taking the Japanese soldiers. All of them. That's impossible. The containment alone. I stepped forward, letting him see what I'd become. My eyes now reflected the spirit realm, showed him the death prayers writhing around us like hungry sharks. Doctor, in about 4 hours, every person who's ever taken a piece of Hawaii home is going to die. Millions of people, unless we use your specimens to stop it. He went pale. I collected a shell from Waikiki last year. Then you're already marked, Auntie Lilia said simply. Help us, or die with the rest. With Dr. Chung's reluctant cooperation, We loaded 42 crystalline containers onto military trucks. As we drove back to Molokai, I could feel the death energy building. The soldiers' eternal dying was like a siren call to every death prayer on the island. They began following us, drawn by the concentrated suffering. We reached Kalaupapa just as the eastern sky began to lighten. The peninsula looked peaceful in the pre-dawn, rolling green hills, dramatic sea cliffs, a scattering of old buildings from the leper colony. But in the spirit realm, it was a maelstrom of anguish. The entrance to Kahai's prison was hidden beneath St. Philomena Church, Father Damien's old church from the 1800s. The irony wasn't lost on me. A place of healing and compassion built directly over a tomb of pure malevolence. "He knows we're here," Uncle Tommy said, blood trickling from his nose. The proximity to such concentrated death energy was affecting all of us physically. We arranged the soldiers' containers in a circle around the church. Dr. Chung and his team set up equipment to crack them open simultaneously, releasing 8 decades of contained death all at once. That's when Kahai spoke, his voice rising from the earth itself. "You bring me gifts?" How thoughtful. The ground cracked, and something began pushing up from below. Not Kahai himself, he was still trapped, but extensions of him. Tentacles made of solidified death prayers, each one capable of killing with a touch. The night marchers materialized, forming a defensive line. "Now!" Ku'ali'i commanded. Dr. Chung triggered the release. All 42 containers shattered simultaneously. What happened next defied description. The Japanese soldiers, freed from their 8-decade death loop, stood up. But they weren't alive. They were something else. Death, incarnate, shaped like men. Their eyes were portals to the moment of their dying, endlessly recurring, and they were angry. 80 years of suffering had transformed them into something beyond death prayers. They had become anti-death, a negation of mortality itself. When Kahai's tentacles touched them, instead of killing them, how do you kill what's already dead forever? The tentacles began to dissolve. "Impossible!" Kahai's voice cracked with something I'd never expected. Fear. The soldiers advanced in perfect formation, just as they had been trained. But now their enemy wasn't America. It was death itself, embodied in Kahai. They marched down through the crack in the earth, their footsteps echoing with the sound of ending things. "We need to seal him while they have him distracted," Auntie Lelia said. She began pulling out items I recognized from ancient drawings, tools of the highest kahuna magic. A lei niho palawa, whale-tooth pendant, that had belonged to Kamehameha I. A wooden idol that predated human memory, water from the sacred pool at Molokai's birth. But as she began the sealing ritual, something went wrong. The death prayers, instead of turning on each other as we'd planned, began to converge. They were merging, becoming something greater and more terrible than their sum. "He's using the soldier's energy to complete his transformation," Uncle Tommy realized. "We didn't weaken him. We gave him exactly what he needed." The crack widened. Something massive began emerging. Kahai Makayo, after 374 years of imprisonment, was finally breaking free. But he no longer looked human. Centuries of absorbing death had transformed him into a creature of pure ending, a walking extinction event shaped vaguely like a man. He stood 30 feet tall, his body composed of every death that had occurred on Molokai. I could see faces in his skin: lepers, warriors, children who had died of disease, tourists who had fallen from cliffs. All of them were part of him now, their deaths woven into his being. "I am grateful," he said, his voice the sound of everything ending at once. "You have given me the final components I needed. The foreign deaths, the modern deaths, the technological deaths. I am no longer merely Hawaiian. I am universal death, applicable to all peoples, all nations. He gestured, and people began dying, not just on Molokai, but worldwide. Everyone who had any connection to Hawaii, anyone who had visited, anyone who had family there, anyone who had even dreamed of the islands, they all felt the touch of his power. The death toll is in the thousands and climbing, Nakamura reported, somehow still receiving data feeds in this chaos. He's not just killing them. He's adding their deaths to himself, growing stronger with each one. That's when I understood what we were really facing. Kahai hadn't spent 374 years planning revenge. He'd spent them evolving, transforming from a Hawaiian sorcerer into something that transcended culture, race, and nationality. He had become death itself, and he was claiming his kingdom. "There's only one way to stop him," Kuali said, and I could hear the weight of centuries in his voice. "Someone has to take his place." "What do you mean?" "Death requires a keeper, someone to maintain the balance between life and ending. Kahai has corrupted that role, turned it into a weapon, but if someone else claimed it, someone with the strength to resist the corruption." He looked directly at me. "No," Uncle Tommy said immediately. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," Auntie Lelia said sadly. "Kawika has the bloodline protection. He can touch death without dying. He can enter Kahai's realm and challenge him for control. But if I fail, then death wins and life ends. Not just here, but everywhere. Kahai will spread across the world like a plague, killing everything capable of dying." I looked at the monster Kahai had become, at the dying people around the world, at my friends and family prepared to sacrifice everything. The choice was no choice at all. Tell me what to do. Uncle Tommy began preparing me for something no living person should attempt, a willing death that wasn't death, a transformation that would either save everyone or doom them all. The ritual required 3 things: a death freely given, a life freely taken, and a balance freely accepted. "You must kill part of yourself," he explained, "the part that fears death. You must take life from Kahai, steal back the deaths he's hoarding. And you must accept the role of death's keeper, neither living nor dead, but forever between." As they painted my body with symbols that hurt to wear, as they spoke words that human mouths shouldn't shape, I thought about my grandmother, Laura Meho, who had bound her mana to our bloodline. Had she known this day would come? Had she been preparing me for this moment my entire life? The sun was rising as I walked toward Kahai. He towered above me, a mountain of death shaped like a man. His laughter shook the island. You? You think you can challenge me? I am death incarnate." "No," I said, and my voice carried the authority of my bloodline, the power of every Maho who had ever lived. "You're just a thief. You steal deaths that aren't yours, hoard them like a miser. I'm here to take them back." I reached out and touched him. The moment my hand made contact with his form, I experienced every death he had absorbed. Thousands of years of ending flooded through me. Violent deaths, peaceful deaths, young deaths, old deaths. Each one was a complete existence, an entire life brought to its conclusion. The weight of it should have destroyed me instantly, but my grandmother's protection held. The deaths passed through me without sticking, like water through a filter. And as they passed, I began to understand something Kahai had missed in his centuries of planning. Death wasn't power. Death wasn't an ending. Death was a doorway. The moment I understood death as a doorway rather than an ending, everything changed. The thousands of deaths flowing through me stopped being weapons and became what they truly were: transitions, passages from one state to another, and each doorway opened both ways. Kahai felt the shift immediately. "What are you doing?" His mountainous form wavered. "I'm giving them back," I said, and opened every doorway at once. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic for him. Every death he had stolen began reversing, not bringing the dead back to life, but returning their deaths to them, giving them ownership of their own endings. The lepers of Kalopapa reclaimed their suffering. The warriors took back their final battles. The tourists retrieved their accidental endings. And as each death returned to its rightful owner, Kahai shrank. "No," he screamed, his form collapsing. "I am eternal." "You're a man who forgot how to die," I finished. "Let me remind you." I pushed deeper into the connection between us, past the stolen deaths, past the centuries of accumulated power, to the core of what Kahai Makayo had once been. A frightened kahuna who had discovered death prayers and become so terrified of his own mortality that he had tried to become death itself. There, at his center, I found it. His original death, the one he should have experienced 374 years ago when the other kahuna united against him. He had postponed it, hidden from it, buried it under millions of other deaths. But it was still there, waiting patiently. "Everyone dies," I told him, almost gently. "Even death dies eventually. That's the balance. That's what you never understood." I pulled his original death to the surface. Kahai's scream shattered windows across Molokai. His massive form collapsed, shedding stolen deaths like a molting snake sheds skin. The deaths dispersed, returning to their places in history, their purposes fulfilled. The tentacles of solidified death prayers dissolved into mist. The crack in the earth began to seal, but Kahai wasn't done. As he shrank back to human size, his true form was revealed. Not the mighty sorcerer of legend, but a withered old man, ancient beyond measure, kept alive only by the deaths he had stolen. "If I die," he gasped, "death dies with me. I've become too intertwined with it. Kill me, and no one will ever die again." Life without death is not paradise, it's hell. I could feel the truth in his words. He had spent so long being death that he had become necessary to its function. Removing him completely would break the cycle. That's when Auntie Lilia stepped forward. "There is another way," she said. "The position of Death's keeper isn't destroyed, just transferred. Someone must take his place." "I already said I would," I began. "No," she interrupted. "You're needed here, in life. To guard the boundaries, to prevent this from happening again." She smiled, and for the first time I saw peace in her eyes. "I'm 94 years old. I've lived a full life. Let me have a meaningful death." Before anyone could stop her, she placed her hand on Kahai's chest. "I accept the transfer. I accept the responsibility. I accept the balance." Light exploded between them. I saw in that moment the true nature of the transaction. The role of Death's keeper wasn't about power or control. It was about service, maintaining the balance between life and ending, ensuring that death remained a doorway rather than a wall. Kahai's expression changed from triumph to confusion to something like relief. "Finally," he whispered, and crumbled to dust. Auntie Lilia absorbed the role, but she didn't transform into a monster. Instead, she became something else, translucent, existing simultaneously in multiple states. She was alive and dead, present and absent, human and more than human. "The balance is restored," she announced, her voice carrying harmonics from beyond the physical world. "Death returns to its proper function." Around the world, the dying stopped. Not death itself, that continued as it always had, but the weaponized dying that Kahai had unleashed. The death prayers dissolved, their purpose nullified. The stolen deaths found peace. The night marchers saluted Auntie Lilia, recognizing her new status, then faded back into their eternal patrol. The Japanese soldiers, finally released from their 8-decade dying loop, collapsed into peaceful dust. Even the crack in the earth that had held Kahai sealed itself, leaving only disturbed ground to mark where it had been. But the changes weren't over. "Molokai is different now," Uncle Tommy observed, and he was right. The island's spiritual weight had shifted. The Kapu zones were still dangerous, but they were no longer actively malevolent. They had become what they were originally meant to be: memorials to power, reminders of consequences, sacred spaces where the veil between worlds remained thin but not torn. Agent Nakamura was on her phone, receiving reports. "The global death count from Kahai's attack is holding at 3,847, but they're all being reversed. People who flatlined are recovering, without explanation. Medical professionals are calling it a miracle." "Not a miracle," Auntie Lilia said, her form solidifying enough to look almost normal. "A correction. Death taken wrongly must be returned. That's the new rule I'm implementing." She turned to me. "Kawika, you've been changed by this experience. You've touched death and lived. You can see both sides now." She was right. My vision had permanently shifted. I could see the spirit realm overlaid on the physical, could see the doorways that death represented, could feel the balance between ending and beginning. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. "You're the guardian now," she continued. "Not of death, but of the boundary. Make sure no one ever again tries to weaponize the sacred. Make sure the balance holds." I understood. My role as a Department of Hawaiian Homelands officer had just expanded infinitely. I wasn't just protecting physical land anymore, but the spiritual territory that existed alongside it. Over the next few weeks, changes rippled across Hawaii. The Federal Office of Indigenous Metaphysical Events established a permanent presence on Molokai, with me as their liaison. Dr. Chung's facility was shut down, and all the preserved death prayer victims were given proper burial rites. The resort company that had tried to excavate Kahai's prison was investigated, and connections to decades of attempted weaponization of Hawaiian spiritual practices were uncovered. Uncle Tommy established a new training program for young Hawaiians, teaching them the old ways but also the new understanding that death prayers and life blessings were two sides of the same coin, that power without balance was corruption, that the ancestors watched and judged from both sides of death's door. The Kapu zones were officially mapped and protected, with warning signs in 17 languages. Tourist education programs were implemented, explaining not just the physical dangers but the spiritual significance of these spaces. For the first time, the true history of the Kahuna Wars was added to school curricula, but the most significant change was in how death was understood on Molokai. Under Auntie Lilia's guardianship, death became less frightening. People still died, that was the natural order, but they died properly, peacefully. Each death a doorway to whatever came next rather than a weapon or a theft. The death prayers still existed, hibernating in their designated zones, but they no longer hunted. They had become what they were originally intended to be: deterrents, warnings, reminders that some powers should never be unleashed carelessly. 6 months after the Kahai incident, I stood at the Kalapapa overlook, watching the sunset over the peninsula. The tourist beside me was taking photos, completely unaware that he was standing where reality had almost ended. "Beautiful place," he commented. "It is," I agreed. "But it's also powerful. Dangerous if you don't respect it." He laughed. "Come on, it's just an island." I could have corrected him, could have told him about the thousands of death prayers still dormant in the forests, about the night marchers who still patrolled the ancient paths, about how his dismissive attitude was exactly what had awakened Kahai. But I didn't. Instead, I simply said, "Every island has its secrets. Molokai just keeps theirs closer than most." He wandered off to take more photos, and I remained at the overlook. In the spirit realm, I could see Auntie Lelia standing beside me, maintaining her eternal watch. Behind her, the spirits of Kalapapa, the lepers, the caregivers, Father Damien himself, stood at peace, their suffering no longer feeding anything dark. "Any regrets?" I asked her. "How can I regret becoming what I was always meant to be?" she replied. "I spent 94 years preparing for this moment without knowing it. Every prayer I learned, every blessing I gave, every person I helped transition, it was all preparation for becoming Death's keeper. And Kahai? Gone but not forgotten. His story serves as a warning. Those who try to cheat death inevitably become its slave. Better to accept mortality than to try to master it." A tour group was approaching, their guide telling them sanitized stories about Molokai's friendly reputation. I thought about intervening, telling them the truth, but decided against it. Some knowledge had to be earned, not given. Those who needed to know about Molokai's true nature would find out. The island itself would make sure of that. As night fell, I drove back to my office in Konakakai. On my desk was a new stack of reports. Mysterious deaths in Maui that didn't match any known patterns. Ancient Hawaiian artifacts appearing in impossible places on Oahu, and sightings of warriors in traditional garb walking through Waikiki at midnight. The Kahai incident had changed more than just Molokai. It had awakened something across all the Hawaiian islands. The spiritual and physical worlds were converging, the ancient and modern colliding, and I was apparently the one responsible for maintaining the balance. I opened the first report and began reading. A hotel in Honolulu built on an ancient heiau was experiencing temporal distortions. Guests were checking in but aging years overnight. The hotel management wanted it handled quietly. I grabbed my gear and headed for the airport. As I flew over the channel between Molokai and Oahu, I could see them in the water below, massive shadows that weren't whales, weren't ships, weren't anything that belonged in the physical world. The Akua, the ancient gods, were stirring. Auntie Lilia appeared in the seat beside me, visible only to my changed sight. "The barriers are weakening everywhere," she said. "Kahai's awakening was just the beginning. The old agreements between the physical and spiritual are breaking down. Why? Because it's time. The world is changing, technology is advancing, but the spiritual foundations remain. They can't be ignored anymore. Hawaii is just the first place where the two worlds are merging visibly. And we're supposed to manage this merger?" She smiled. "Not manage. Navigate, guide, help both worlds understand that they were never really separate to begin with." As the plane descended toward Honolulu, I could see the city differently now. The modern buildings overlaid with ancient structures, the streets following paths that warriors had walked for millennia, the hotels and shops built on ground soaked with mana and blood and prayer. This was my job now, not just protecting the land, but protecting the balance between what was, what is, and what might be, between the seen and unseen, between life and death. Molokai had been the test case, the proof that the spiritual and physical could collide catastrophically if not properly managed. But it had also shown that with the right knowledge, the right protections, and the right people, that collision could become a convergence instead. The flight attendant announced our descent into Honolulu International Airport. In the spirit realm, I could see other planes, vessels from other times, other possibilities, all landing at once in a space that existed across multiple dimensions. "Welcome to the new normal," Auntie Lelia said, fading as the physical world reasserted itself. I gathered my things, preparing to face whatever spiritual crisis awaited in Honolulu. But I wasn't worried. I had survived Kahai, had touched death and lived, had helped restore the balance between worlds. Whatever came next, I was ready. Besides, I wasn't alone. The ancestors were watching. The night marchers were patrolling. Auntie Lilia was maintaining the balance, and across the islands, others like me were awakening to their true roles as guardians of the boundary. Molokai might be the island of death prayers, but it was also the island that had shown us how to transform death from a weapon into a doorway. That knowledge would be crucial for what was coming. Because if Hawaii was where the spiritual and physical worlds were merging first, it wouldn't be the last. The whole world was about to discover what we on Molokai had always known, that some forces are too powerful to control, too dangerous to weaponize, and too important to ignore. The only choice is to respect them, understand them, and maintain the balance. Otherwise, you might find yourself on the wrong side of a death prayer that's been waiting 400 years for someone foolish enough to wake it up. If you're planning to visit Molokai, remember this: respect the kapu zones. Don't take anything from the island. And if you see lights in the forest that shouldn't exist, walk the other way. The death prayers are sleeping now, but sleep is not the same as death. And on Molokai, even death isn't permanent.